Hello, and thank you for joining us today for the fifth session on the principles of Housing First. Today we'll be looking at choice and self-determination. Hello, and thank you for joining us today for the fifth session on the principles of Housing First. Today we'll be looking at choice and self-determination. I would like to begin today by acknowledging that I am meeting you from the country of the Wurundjeri people, the largest Aboriginal nation within New South Wales. I acknowledge past elders whose spirits remain strong today within the people and lands of Albury. And I give my respect to present elders for the continued care of place and community. And I extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people present here today, as I recognise the valuable gift that's given to us all when traditional knowledge and truth-telling is shared. Today, we have Leah from Housing Choices Western Australia. They're a community housing provider, and Leah has a career primarily in the homelessness sector. And I'm Liam from Yes Unlimited. We are a non-government organisation that delivers housing support in the Albury region. And I'm a housing support worker, and I've had over 10 years experience working in the homelessness sector. And I'm going to talk to you through the principles of choice and self-determination. And then we'll put the slides away and Leah and I will chat about what that means in day-to-day practice. Now, during this webinar, we really want to encourage you to leave any questions in the Q&A functions, and we'll answer anything that we can at the end of the webinar. And because it's a webinar, you're automatically on mute with your camera off. So if you need to sneeze, cough, applaud, don't worry, no one can see you or hear you. Now, I'm not sure if you've been sitting in on the other webinars in the series. We've been working our way through the different principles and looking at what they mean and how we can put them into practice in our day-to-day work. I highly recommend that you check out webinars in the future, and Trish will pop the link into the chat if you'd like to book in. You can also watch previous webinars that have been already happened on the CHP YouTube channel, where all the webinars in the series are uploaded, and that'll also be in the chat. So what is choice and self-determination, and what does it mean as a housing first principle? By including it as a housing first principle, we're saying that it's a fundamental thing that we should underpin our practice and our policies and the way that we interact with people. And in Housing First Principles for Australia, choice and self-determination is broken down into a number of core areas where we believe people should be given choice to be in charge of the decisions which have a major impact on their lives. When we look at the concept of home from a housing first perspective, we're ensuring that we give people choice to make decisions around where they want their home to be. We need to ask and we need to listen to the people that we're supporting to find out where they want to live and what type of housing they want to live in. So we ask questions like, where do you want to live? Do you want to live in a social or a community housing property? Do you want to live in a private rental? Do you want to live in a flat or a house or a unit? And it's really important that when we're working with someone that identifies as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, that we consider their connection to country as well. And where possible, we try and support them to connect or relocate to their country. But we also need to be transparent and realistic with the people that we're working with. And we need to let them know that if they only want to live in a mansion, that might not be a realistic option for them. Or if they're only choosing properties in an area that might be outside of their price range, that we highlight that as well. And we also need to acknowledge that people have some limitations in relation to the social and community housing system around their allocation of properties. However, ultimately, we need to remember that they're the people that get to choose where they want to live. When we look at support from a Housing First perspective, the concept of choice and self-determination is paramount. As workers in the housing field, we've often made housing conditional on the support that someone is accessing and thereby remove the choice that people have. We've made statements like, if you don't go into a detox centre, then you can't access the refuge. Or if you don't engage with a mental health service, then we can't put you into a transitional property. This approach is counterproductive because people are not given the supports that they want in a time frame that's relevant for them to make positive change. When we're looking things from a Housing First perspective, we remove the conditionality around housing and support. So if a person decides that they're ready to access support services, we're able to work with them to make it happen. However, they get to choose who they will see, they get to choose when they'll see them, and they get to choose where they'll receive the supports. Choice and self-determination is important in relation to a household makeup, just as it is in relation to support. As professionals, we've often put restrictions onto people saying that they can only have people visit or stay that we have approved. And then we'll make statements like, if you have someone that stays with you for more than a certain number of days a week, then you're putting your tenancy at risk. An alternative approach is to work with people to work out who's important in their world and look to how we can include them on leases when necessary. We've also set expectations around who can be invited into someone's property as well. We've put the expectation that they need to allow us to access their property a set amount of times a month for them to remain on the program. Person-centred approach forms the backbone of the support that we provide in Housing First, as it acknowledges that the person is the expert in their own life. And we acknowledge that the best way that we can support people is by listening to them and responding to their concerns and their dreams. Person-centred support is the practice that we use to deliver choice and self-determination to the people that we work with. So that's an overview of choice and self-determination from Housing First. What we're going to do is we're going to put those away and we're just going to have a little bit of a talk about what that looks in practice.
Thanks, Liam. So having unpacked a little bit about what choice and self-determination means, can you give us an example of a time where choice and self-determination has worked really well in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of years ago, we were working from a Housing First-ish program, and someone came to our services, and I'm going to call them Sally, just to protect them. And when Sally approached our services a couple of years ago, she identified quite quickly that she had been homeless for a few years, and she'd been couch surfing, and that she'd been sleeping rough. And that she had some problems with her drinking and some drug use problems as well. She had some mental health issues that she was quite happy to identify. And she also had some problems with her teeth as well. What we were able to do, because it was a Housing First-ish program, and I say ish because it wasn't traditionally Housing First, we were adapting and using what principles that we could. We were able to support this person who to our property quite quickly with working with a social housing provider in town, and she was accommodated quite quickly within about 5 to 6 weeks. After she was accommodated, we could have quite quickly jumped into saying, okay, we need to focus on your mental health, or we need to address your drug and alcohol problems as well. Traditionally, we would have done that before putting her into a property, but now she was in a property, that could have been our focus. But instead, what we did is we had a bit of a chat to her and said, okay, you're in a property, what would you like to work on now? And so we had some discussions with Sally and we said, what do you want to work on? And she said she wanted to work on her teeth. And I think that was a pretty revolutionary thing because it wasn't what we were originally thinking. But she really wanted to work on her teeth because that was so important to her, and that gave her confidence and it gave her an ability to actually feel like a person. And so I said, great, let's book you into a dentist. Let's focus on your teeth. And by listening and by putting it back onto Sally, we were able to work with her to address her smile and to get her self-confidence back. But we were also able to engage her and to keep her engaged. And I think the risk would have been if we said, no, first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at your drug use or your mental health, we wouldn't have been listening to Sally, and there would have been a really good chance that she would have disengaged and she would have just fallen through the gaps and potentially returned to homelessness again.
I think the interesting thing when we've talked about this story is that for Sally, her smile was the most important thing for her. Her capacity to engage or do anything else was contingent on feeling confident enough to be able to talk to a person.
Absolutely.
So all those referrals to other services wouldn't have worked. We hadn't listened to her to go, actually, this is what's most important to you.
Definitely. And it was as simple as that. It was slowing the process down, because I think we quite often think we've got to approach something at rapid warp speed, but it was slowing the process down and really talking and taking the time to listen to what she really wanted. And yeah, how important it is for you to be able to feel that you can actually go out there and you can, with self-confidence, talk to someone and have someone listen to you. And if you're consciously like trying to hide your teeth the whole time, it just is an obstacle for you.
That's probably part of the joy of Housing First, because you've done the biggest thing possible for someone, which is given them a home. You can then, you're not in crisis anymore. You can actually slow down and rebuild someone's life. How about a counterexample of maybe where it hasn't worked so well because you haven't listened to people's choice?
Yeah, definitely. I'm thinking back to an example quite a number of years ago. I worked with a young person. I'll call him Sam. Sam had been at high school, and high school really didn't suit him. And so at that time, we had another service in town that was offering a different alternative educational option. And it was a virtual school, and it was really slow, and it was one-on-one, and it was like really intensive. And so we worked with Sam and said, great, let's put you into this educational option. And he was like, yeah, great, let's do it. I got to know Sam pretty well over the time, and I have over the years worked with Sam multiple times. But when I first got to know him, he used to ride his motorbike everywhere. He'd be out in the back paddocks and he'd be thrashing his motorbike everywhere. I'd catch up with him and he'd have like fresh scars on his legs where he'd come off his motorbike or he'd burn himself or something like that. And then like, I thought, great, this guy is right into motorbikes. It's a passion of his. Isn't that great? And when we were doing the virtual school and he was doing these one-on-one meetings with this other, like the teacher, he'd do projects on motorbikes and things like that. And I was like, right, we know this guy is all about motorbikes. That's amazing. The teacher had a really good friend in town who ran a mechanic shop. And he thought to himself, great, we've got this person that loves motorbikes. We're going to get him like an apprenticeship as a mechanic. He'll be fixing motorbikes. It'll change his life. It'll change his life for the good, and he will have this amazing outcome. And won't we feel all warm and fuzzy at the end of it, because he's got this sort of amazing mechanic apprenticeship and we're going to change everything for him. So he was having all these conversations with this mechanic friend of his and sort of setting it up and making sure he'd have it like the clothes and everything together. We didn't talk to Sam. We just thought this is the amazing option that's going to be amazing for Sam in the long run. the day of him starting this apprenticeship rolled up, and we got a phone call, and the phone call was from the guy at the mechanics, and he said, Sam hasn't turned up. And we thought, oh, okay, what's happened there? Maybe something's happened, maybe something with a family or something's come up. We didn't think too much about it. And then the next day he didn't turn up, and the day after that he didn't turn up. And I was like, okay, what have we missed here? And I went and I had a chat to him, and when I actually talked to him, he never wanted to be a mechanic. Sure, he loved riding his motorbike. Sure, he loved sort of thrashing it around in the backyard and riding all over the place. But he never wanted to be a mechanic. But we thought he did. And so we had not even given him a choice in what the outcome of basically his whole life was. We had just decided this is going to be amazing for him. Let's just go ahead and set him up for this. And it didn't work. And luckily for us, he came back, but he disengaged pretty quickly after that, because I feel like we weren't hearing him and he wasn't feeling that he was being listened. But luckily he represented and he kept coming back throughout the years. And I've worked with Sam quite a number of times since then. But yeah, it was a really good example of, and it was one of these learnings that I've taken throughout my career where I was like, hang on, who am I working for? Am I working for myself or am I working for the person? And in that time, I wasn't working for Sam at all. I was working because I thought I was going to get this great outcome and it's going to be amazing, but I didn't stop and it didn't take the time to listen.
I think, what's particularly sad in that story is that because we hadn't listened to Sam, his experience became one of failure. Like he let people down, his guilt around that stuff, which actually, if we'd taken the time to listen to him, it's almost like we set him up a little bit there, which is probably why he had that disengagement afterwards in comparison to your earlier story with Sally, where you get all this great engagement because you focused on what the person's most important to them.
Totally. Yeah. Excellent. And it really sort of it's about taking that time and really listening and slowing things down and making sure you're hearing what people are saying.
Yep.
Yep. So, Leah, can you tell me how we can include people in choice about how a service runs, not just in how we do case plans?
I think this is really interesting because the choice and self-determination doesn't have to just be for the individual and their case plan. We can actually include the people we're working with in lots of choice and particularly self-determination around how we run our services as a whole. So a really lovely example of that is we had a project I was involved with a little while ago called Wongi Maya, which was sort of focused around this very, very large extended Aboriginal family who'd had lots of experiences of street sleeping and things like that. So what we did know is that what we'd been doing hadn't been working. So we wanted to, try and deliver a service differently. And to do that, we just went with, we'll allocate a worker, we know that they trust and has great relationships with them. And then from there, we will just listen to the mob and do what the mob tell us to do. So right at the start of it, she had a yarning session with a whole bunch of people from the mob. And the first thing they said to her was, right, Margaret, you've got to throw your diary out. We're not coming for appointments. She was based at a drop-in centre and they said, well, we will just show up. And if you're there, you can help us. And if you're not there, we know you're helping someone else with our mob. We'll just come back later. And that really made us rethink how you design a service and rework how you do things in a service. And rather than, casework is often about, whilst, you might be giving people choices about what time to come, it can be often quite appointment based. And they were really upfront about saying, that's not going to work for us. And that sort of approach of going with what the mob wanted was sort of run all the way through the program. There was a point where we started working really closely with one of the elders involved in the community who sort of really worked alongside us and lots of, helping us understand his mob and lots of the cultural stuff. And there was a point where he said to us, what I really want you to do now is I've got this old VHS of my mum and I want you to turn that into a get it onto a USB stick so we can have a showing of it for the whole family. And it's like, this is not usually in the bounds of things that you end up doing in your casework process.
Yeah.
And we ended up doing it, and his mum was the woman who the program was actually named after, Wongi. And so we had this amazing event where we got this thing, and no one had been able to see this video for years and years, because this was an old VHS and no one had VHSs anymore. Because we got it converted, we had this showing, and a whole bunch of the mob all showed up to see this woman, this grandmother of their community, talking about how important they were to her, and how much she wanted to see them housed. It was a really transformative experience by actually just really leaning into people saying, well, this is important and this is what will make a difference to us.
Yeah. What a great different approach, like to making something fit the people as opposed to making the people fit program.
And just absolutely heads up to the woman I worked with on the program, Margaret, because she just totally and utterly leaned into that choice and self-determination. So to the point where we had a few years ago, we had this Homelessness Week event in Perth, and rather than doing the usual, barbecue type things, we, the 2 day centres actually decided that they would stay open for 24/7 for that 2 weeks. And that all the work, we'd shut one and all the workers would go to the other one so that it could stay open, and everyone was volunteering to cover shifts and things. And our centre was only open between 7 at night and 7 in the morning for women, so that they wanted a bit of space away from the blokes. And so Margaret just went with that week and just took it to the mob and said, when do you want me to work? Do you want me to do my normal job? Do you want me to work any of these shifts? What do you want me to do? And the mob just came back and said, right, so we want you to work, midnight till 7 in the morning to look after the girls. And so that's what she did for the week. She followed their direction, and it made a really, really big difference in terms of how embedded she became with that community and how the sort of outcomes and things she was able to get, but also for us to learn a really different way to work because it hadn't been working until then.
Yeah, great. What about on the flip side? Can you sort of explain to us what sort of practices might unintentionally remove choice from people? I
think we don't realise that sometimes some of the practices we do, or some of the assumptions that we make that, remove choice. So, I think when you look at your case planning, I really love tools like the Outcome Star, but it really, it directs you to those core areas of the things that are important. And I know if you're a manager of a service, have a look at your case plans of the people that your staff are doing, because if they're all about mental health and drug and alcohol, and they start to look a bit samey, there's probably not as much choice and self-determination going as you want. Whereas if you see case plans that are about, I want to get a girlfriend and I, want to go to the footy and, those sort of things, there's probably more going on there. Things like how we, within a service, how we do things like allocate ER. So I know when I was emergency relief, in case that's a different term, there was one service I was working with, staff were complaining about, do they only ever ring us when they want us to come out and bring them food? And thinking, well, we've got to restrict that. We can only go so many times or so often, or we've got to say no after a while. And then, we sat and unpacked it for a bit and went, people are poor. That's why they're asking you to bring them food, is because they live in poverty. It makes a big difference to them. And actually by leaning in and saying yes, by taking food out, then you end up, that's a step in the door. That's the thing, like with your stories, it opens up that trust. Our policies can make workers close down the trust rather than enabling workers to lean into that trust. And then at a bigger level, like we think about whole systems, the way social housing is allocated, this idea that, you're on a list for umpteen many years, and then eventually you get to the top of the list and you're offered a house, and the only thing you had to say in it was it's somewhere in this large region and it's got the right number of bedroom sizes, and it's like 3 days, decide on if you want it or not, and if you don't want it, you go to the bottom of the list again. And that's really taking a lot of choice out of that. So I think where you've seen programs that have worked really well is where you've had some of that collective impact and collaborative programs where they've been able to do best fit allocations of getting the right person in the right house, because it makes so much difference in terms of outcomes.
Totally. I know that we have a similar problem with housing allocations in my region, like in Albury and in New South Wales, where it's sort of like there's such a long wait. I was talking to the social housing provider the other day, and they said like it's a 10-year wait for you to actually get allocated a property at the moment. And then after waiting that length of time, you've got that set amount of days to choose. And if you've been waiting for such a long time, and then you've got like 3 days to actually decide, and if you don't, it's another X amount of years wait, then you're really removing all choices.
Right. We've got a little bit of time left, probably not very long. I noticed we've got someone with their hand up. Trish, do you want to see if we can get that question from?
I'm just going to ask Nicholas to. Oh, Nicholas has jumped off at the moment, unfortunately. We did have some early questions in the actual Q&A, and I think I certainly was absorbed in hearing about those real practice examples, and it really reflected to me your journeys in terms of reflecting on the program journey, not just the individual journey, but then thinking about, I'll stay with what Liam said about helping someone keep smiling. But earlier on, we did have a question which asked about, can Housing First work for people who want to live in congregate living rather than, I think you touched on this briefly, but does that fit with the model?
Like, one of the fundamental principles in Housing First is that people have access to a home with a full tenancy rights and things like that. But I think you also need to think about the choice and self-determination principle and how that interacts with that. And we've had quite a bit of debate in WA over the role of lodging houses or boarding houses. I'm not sure what you call them in different states. And I think while for most people, they're not stable, it's not their housing of choice, it's that all they can afford or whatever they've got. It's a temporary stop on the way towards Housing First. We have got a very small group of people for whom lodging is their housing of choice. So we've got one of our big providers here who had quite a small lodging house. So it's only about 5 or 6 older blokes who lived together. And when they moved them into permanent housing, after a while they all came back, because actually that style of housing was their housing of choice, because they liked the simplicity of one room, one bill, and they particularly liked having someone to sit and watch the telly with. And, that sort of, it was for them, that was that choice. So I think you need to lean into that choice. I think also when you look at the Housing First for Youth principles, they lean a lot more heavily into that choice and self-determination around that housing stuff, because young people's housing journey is often different to adults, because they like share houses, they move a lot. For some of them, that transitional skills-based learning stuff is what they need at that point in time. So I think that's why, you really need to lean into that and see what works for the person, but whilst keeping that sort of fundamental integrity to the long-term housing for people who they get that, but they only get the other one if that's what they prefer.
Thanks so much for that, Leah. And the earlier one that came up for me was when people's really acknowledging that housing preference and what people want. What happens if that's outside of the area that you geographically work? How do you manage that?
I think it's about working with the people and really helping people to get where they want to be. I think we really need to listen to people, and there can be some really good reasons why people want to be in a different area, whether it's connection to family or connection to country, or maybe there's employment. And if we don't listen and lean in and offer that support and try and support someone to get to where they want to be, we're putting obstacles in place that can potentially cause that tenancy that they might be in just to not be a valid option for them. It'll be something that it might suit them today, but it won't suit them in the long run.
I think that's really well said. I'm going to just very quickly put a very short evaluation into the chat for everyone. Sorry, jump on in, Leah.
I was just going to say I'm conscious of the time. So yeah, if you put that evaluation in, if anyone could do that, that would be fantastic. We'd like to just, as we leave, thank the Lord Mayor's Charitable Fund Foundation from Melbourne and Homelessness Australia, Council of Homeless Persons and the Housing First Train the Trainers community practice, who helped collate the materials and have supported this work that we've been doing over the years. The next webinar in the series will be on the 11th of October, and it will focus on social and community inclusion, and that will be Liam and I again, and we'll do a similar thing. So hopefully we'll see you all then, and that you've enjoyed our session today.
Yeah, please join us on the 11th.
Bye everyone.
Bye.